An image like no other, inspiring decades of research and debate. The Shroud of Turin, that's a piece of history, and it has an ongoing puzzle for scientists.
3 independent genetics laboratories reportedly analyzed DNA samples taken from the bloodstains on the Shroud of Turin. After completing their sequencing work, something unusual happened. All 3 labs suddenly stopped talking about their findings. There were no press conferences, no detailed public explanations, and no scientific debates in the media. Just silence. What made the situation even more puzzling was what researchers allegedly discovered in the genetic material itself. According to those familiar with the analysis, the DNA extracted from the cloth does not clearly match any modern human population known today. Some of the genetic markers appear incredibly ancient, linked to lineages that may have disappeared from the human family tree thousands of years ago. But the most startling detail was the condition of the DNA. Normally, when genetic material ages over centuries or millennia, it slowly degrades and breaks apart in predictable ways. The DNA fragments become worn down by time, bacteria, and environmental exposure. This was different. Instead of the gradual decay scientists expect to see in ancient samples, the chromosomes appeared violently fragmented, almost as if the genetic structure had been shattered all at once. Researchers described it not as simple deterioration, but as a kind of cellular explosion, where the DNA inside the cells seemed to break apart simultaneously. To some scientists, the pattern looked less like the normal aging of biological material and more like the result of a sudden, extremely intense burst of energy affecting every cell at the same moment. That unexplained detail is exactly what keeps the mystery of the Shroud of Turin alive today, a relic that continues to puzzle historians, geneticists, and researchers around the world. Each laboratory repeated the analysis more than once. At first, the scientists assumed there had to be a technical error. Maybe their sequencing machines were malfunctioning. Maybe the equipment was miscalibrated. But after running the tests again and again, the results stayed the same. The machines were working perfectly. The strange data was coming directly from the DNA itself. But the mystery surrounding the Shroud of Turin didn't begin in a modern genetics laboratory. To understand where this story really starts, you have to go back to 1978, inside a sealed chamber of a medieval cathedral. The room smelled of aged stone and lingering incense, and inside it stood a group of around 40 of the world's leading scientific experts. They included physicists, chemists, spectroscopists, and even a photographer trained by NASA. Their mission was simple and very direct. Examine the famous cloth and prove it was a forgery. The team gathered around a 14-foot strip of ancient linen, believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. They were not there to confirm a miracle. Their goal was the opposite: find the paint, identify the technique, expose the artist, and finally put the centuries-old legend to rest. For more than 120 hours, they studied every inch of the fabric, using the best technology available at the time: microscopes, chemical analysis, spectral imaging. Every scientific method they had was used to search for evidence of pigment, brushstrokes, or any sign that the image had been artificially created. But they didn't find any. No paint, no dye, no brushstrokes. The image on the cloth existed, yet the usual signs of artistic creation simply weren't there. What began as an attempt to debunk a religious relic slowly turned into something that felt more like a scientific investigation of an unsolved case. Not a ritual, not a prayer gathering, but a careful forensic examination. And the deeper researchers looked, the stranger the evidence seemed to become. Some scientists who later studied biological traces from the cloth suggested that whoever bled onto it didn't simply die in an ordinary way. The microscopic evidence hinted at damage that appeared to affect the body at the cellular level, as if an intense event had disrupted the biological structure itself. Even today, many researchers say the Shroud of Turin is far from a closed chapter of history. Instead, it remains an open scientific puzzle, a kind of unfinished forensic file that continues to draw new investigators, new technologies, and new questions about what really happened to the person whose image appears on that ancient linen. Before we dive deeper into the strange DNA results that stunned those laboratories, you need to know about the man whose entire perspective changed during the investigation. His name was Barry Schwarz, a technical photographer who had worked with organizations including NASA. He was Jewish, highly trained in imaging technology, and he joined the research team to do one very specific job: document the evidence that the Shroud of Turin was a forgery. In other words, he was there to help prove the legend wrong. The expectation was simple: take extremely high-resolution photographs, examine the image closely, and reveal the tiny details that would expose the cloth as nothing more than a clever medieval painting. Schwarz even joked about it with colleagues during the flight to Italy. "A free trip to Europe," he said. "Find the fake by Tuesday, celebrate with wine by Wednesday." But that celebration never happened. The moment the cloth was carefully unrolled under bright fluorescent lights, the atmosphere in the room changed. Conversations faded, and a strange quiet settled over the group. Spread out before them was a 14-foot strip of aged linen. The fabric had turned yellow over the centuries, and faintly visible on it was the ghost-like outline of a man's body, marked with wounds. Schwarz began doing exactly what he had come to do. He set up his cameras and started examining the image in extraordinary detail. Millimeter by millimeter, he searched for the microscopic clues that every painted surface leaves behind. Tiny ridges from brush strokes, particles of pigment, or traces of binding materials used in paint. But he couldn't find any. There were no brush marks, no pigment grains, no evidence of paint or dye. The team tested the cloth under normal white light, then under ultraviolet light, and even with infrared imaging. Each method should have revealed signs of artistic materials if the image had been painted. Still, nothing appeared. Later, Schwarz would describe the atmosphere in that room as almost overwhelming. The silence, he said, felt heavy, as if the cloth itself was challenging the scientists to explain how the image had been created. Then another piece of technology entered the investigation, something called the VP8 image analyzer, and that moment changed the entire investigation. The VP8 image analyzer was originally developed by NASA to study space images. Its job was to take flat satellite photographs and convert them into three-dimensional maps of planetary surfaces. Normally, when you feed a regular photograph into this machine, like a picture of a human face, the result looks distorted and chaotic. That's because ordinary photos don't contain real depth information. The light and shadows in a painting or photograph are simply artistic effects, not true measurements of distance. But when researchers placed the image from the Shroud of Turin into the analyzer, something completely unexpected happened. Instead of producing a distorted image, the machine generated a remarkably accurate three-dimensional form of a human body rising from the screen. The brightness levels across the image appeared to correspond directly to the distance between the cloth and the body that had once been wrapped in it. In other words, it looked as if the linen had somehow recorded the physical shape of a real human body, almost the way a photocopier captures the details of a page pressed against its glass. Barry Schwarz reportedly stood there staring at the screen for quite a while. According to later accounts, he didn't say much. The result spoke for itself, and the mystery deepened even further when scientists examined the fibers under a microscope. The image on the cloth isn't embedded deep in the fabric. Instead, it exists only on the very outer surface of the linen fibers. The layer is incredibly thin, measured in micrometers, even thinner than the width of a red blood cell. If you were to gently scrape one of those fibers with a razor blade, the image would disappear instantly, revealing plain white linen underneath. Nothing soaked through the threads, nothing penetrated into the fabric. For scientists, that detail raised even more questions. Throughout history, paints, dyes, and inks all behave in similar ways. They seep into the fibers of cloth to some degree. But in this case, the image appears to rest only on the outermost surface, so shallow that many researchers say no known artistic technique from any historical period can easily explain how it was created. After years of analysis, only one explanation seemed to remain even remotely possible in scientific discussions. The image might have been formed by a sudden and extremely intense burst of radiant energy. The idea suggests that such an event could have dehydrated the surface of the linen at a molecular level, affecting the cellulose in the fibers. At the same time, the burst would have had to be incredibly brief, powerful enough to alter the fabric's surface, but not long enough to burn or destroy it. Even today, no machine on Earth has been able to reproduce that exact effect on linen. But the mystery of the Shroud of Turin didn't stop with the image itself. In fact, the image was only the beginning. Hidden within the threads of the cloth were traces of blood, and those stains would soon turn a strange physics puzzle into something that looked more like a forensic investigation. For nearly 2 decades, skeptics believed the bloodstains were the easiest way to dismiss the relic. The stains appear bright red in several places on the cloth, vivid and almost fresh-looking. To anyone with even a basic understanding of forensic science, that seems suspicious. Normally, when blood dries, it quickly darkens. Within hours, it turns brown, and over long periods, it becomes darker still. Blood that is thousands of years old would typically appear nearly black or degraded into powder-like residue. So seeing red blood on a cloth believed by some to be around 2,000 years old seemed like clear evidence of a fake. Critics suggested it might have been created by someone in the Middle Ages using pigments such as cinnabar to paint convincing wound marks for a religious audience. On the surface, that explanation sounded reasonable. But then a biochemist named Alan Adler began studying the samples more closely. Adler wasn't approaching the cloth from a religious perspective. He was a specialist in blood chemistry, focused on the molecular breakdown of biological materials over time. His work was methodical, clinical, and based entirely on chemical analysis. When he began testing samples from the Shroud of Turin, he expected to confirm the paint theory and finally settle the debate. Instead, the results surprised him. What he discovered in those tests was unusual enough that he reportedly felt compelled to contact Barry Schwarz immediately, calling him in the middle of the night to talk about the findings. What Alan Adler discovered in the samples was something called bilirubin, and not just a small trace of it. The concentrations were unusually high. To understand why that matters, you have to look at what happens inside the human body during extreme physical trauma. When a person is subjected to prolonged, severe torture or massive physical stress, the body begins to break down in very specific ways. As the suffering continues, the liver can start to fail. When that happens, large amounts of bilirubin, a yellowish chemical compound, are released into the bloodstream. This compound can bind tightly to hemoglobin in the blood. When that bond forms, it can prevent the blood from darkening the way it normally would over time. Instead of turning brown or nearly black, the blood can remain red for a very long period. For Adler, that chemical evidence suggested something significant. The unusual color of the stains on the Shroud of Turin might not be the result of paint or artistic pigments at all. Instead, it could reflect blood that had been affected by extreme physical trauma before death. In other words, the red color may be a kind of biochemical snapshot of a body that had endured severe suffering. The forensic details seemed to grow more disturbing the deeper scientists looked. Tests reportedly detected components consistent with real blood, including hemoglobin, albumin, and immunoglobulins, proteins normally found in human blood. When researchers studied the pattern of marks on the image, they counted what appeared to be more than 100 wounds across the back. Some investigators have suggested these marks resemble injuries caused by a Roman flagrum, a type of whip used during Roman Empire punishments. This weapon had multiple leather straps, often tipped with pieces of metal or bone designed to tear the skin during each strike. Other visible details include puncture wounds near the wrists and a large wound along the side of the rib cage, features some researchers say resemble injuries described in historical accounts of Roman crucifixions. Scientists also found microscopic soil particles near the foot area of the cloth. The mineral composition of those particles has been compared with limestone found in the region around Jerusalem, though this point remains debated among scholars. Taken together, these clues have led some investigators to view the cloth almost like a preserved forensic record, a 2,000-year-old scene of physical trauma captured in fabric. Yet one detail continues to puzzle many researchers. Careful examination suggests that the bloodstains soaked into the linen fibers first. Only afterward did the faint body image appear on the cloth. That sequence raises a difficult question for scientists. If the blood was already there, what process created the image later, without disturbing those stains? Another detail made the mystery even more difficult to explain. Wherever blood had soaked into the linen fibers of the Shroud of Turin, the body image simply does not appear. The faint image stops precisely at the edges of the bloodstains. It's as if whatever process created the image avoided those areas completely. In other words, the sequence seems to go like this. The body bled first, the blood bonded with the cloth, and only afterward did something create the faint image across the linen. Yet that process somehow formed a three-dimensional image around the wounds without disturbing the blood that was already there. For investigators, that raises an obvious question. What kind of event could produce such a precise effect? But the mystery deepened again once modern genetic technology entered the picture. When DNA sequencing methods became advanced enough, researchers began attempting to extract genetic material from fibers of the Shroud of Turin. At first, scientists expected the results to be messy and heavily contaminated. After all, the cloth has been handled, displayed, and studied for centuries. It has been touched by priests, researchers, and pilgrims from many different parts of the world. Most experts assumed the genetic data would simply look like a mixture of modern European DNA from countless people who had come into contact with it over time. But when some studies analyzed genetic traces taken from deeper within the fiber structure, rather than from the outer surface where handling contamination is most likely, the results appeared surprisingly complex. Researchers reported finding genetic markers associated with populations from regions including South Asia, North Africa, and parts of the ancient Middle East. Some markers were linked to lineages that are very old, reflecting population groups that existed thousands of years ago. If the cloth had been created by a medieval European artist, critics often argue that you would expect the dominant DNA traces to reflect mostly Western European origins. Instead, the genetic signals detected in some studies resemble a mixture of populations historically connected to the broader Near East and surrounding regions. But even that wasn't the most puzzling detail. When scientists looked closely at the genetic material itself, they noticed something unusual about its condition. The DNA fragments were highly broken and irregular in ways that didn't always resemble the normal patterns seen in ancient biological samples. And that observation opened up yet another layer of questions about what may have happened to the material preserved within the threads of the Shroud of Turin. According to some reports from researchers who examined samples from the Shroud of Turin, the DNA found in certain bloodstain areas appeared to be in an unusual condition. It wasn't simply old or naturally degraded. Instead, the genetic material looked heavily fragmented, with breaks occurring throughout the chromosomes. Normally, when DNA ages, it breaks down slowly and in fairly predictable ways. Scientists often compare it to the gradual aging of paper in an old book. Page by page, the material becomes weaker and more fragile over time. But in these samples, the fragmentation pattern seemed more chaotic. Rather than showing the slow effects of age alone, the DNA appeared as if it had experienced severe disruption at the molecular level. In biology, patterns like that can sometimes be associated with extreme cellular stress or major physical trauma. When cells are exposed to intense damage, the genetic material inside them can break apart much more dramatically than it would through normal aging. Researchers involved in testing the samples reportedly repeated their analyses several times. Different laboratories examined the material, recalibrated their equipment, and reran the sequencing in order to rule out simple technical errors. Yet the unusual patterns kept appearing in the data. Since then, the subject has remained highly debated within the scientific community. Some researchers argue that contamination, environmental damage, or centuries of handling could explain many of the strange results. Others believe more detailed studies are still needed before any firm conclusions can be drawn. What continues to intrigue investigators is that every time new technology is used to study the Shroud of Turin, whether advanced imaging, chemical analysis, or genetic sequencing, the cloth seems to raise new questions rather than simple answers. Modern science has achieved extraordinary things. Humanity has sent robotic missions to Mars, and astronomers working with the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration even managed to capture the first image of a black hole millions of light-years away. Yet despite all that technological progress, the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most puzzling artifacts ever studied. Scientists still debate how the image formed, how the bloodstains were preserved, and what the genetic traces within its fibers truly represent. For now, the cloth continues to sit at the crossroads of history, science, and mystery, an ancient piece of linen that still refuses to give up all of its secrets. In the end, Barry Schwarz, the Jewish skeptic who originally traveled to Italy expecting to expose a famous relic as a forgery, spent the rest of his life doing something very different. Instead of debunking the Shroud of Turin, he dedicated decades to carefully preserving and sharing the scientific data collected during the investigation. Much of that work he made available freely to researchers and the public. In interviews later in life, Schwarz often reflected on how unexpected that journey had been. He once explained that he had gone to Italy expecting to help prove the cloth was a fake, but what he encountered instead raised questions that science still struggles to answer. So it leaves us with a fascinating puzzle. If the chemical evidence suggests a body that experienced extreme physical trauma, if genetic traces from the cloth point toward ancient populations connected to the Middle East, and if the image itself formed on the linen in a way that produced a detailed three-dimensional pattern without scorching or penetrating the fabric, then what kind of event could create an image like that on a burial cloth while leaving so many unanswered questions behind? That's the mystery that continues to surround the Shroud of Turin today. Some people believe that as technology continues to improve, science will eventually uncover a clear explanation. Others think the cloth may point to something that current scientific tools simply aren't designed to measure. Wherever you stand, the debate continues, and every new investigation adds another piece to one of the most intriguing historical puzzles ever studied. If you enjoy exploring mysteries where history, science, and unexplained evidence intersect, you can keep following stories like this. There are still many unanswered questions out there waiting to be examined.